Have you ever felt lonely right in your own home? Have you ever looked at the person beside you and realized the distance between you has grown larger than a lifetime? This is the story of Frank Thompson, a man who has reached the age of 68. He was once a mechanic, working tirelessly his entire life to provide for his family. He always believed that in his old age, he would spend peaceful days with his wife, enjoying sunsets together, sipping coffee, and reminiscing about the years gone by. But reality turned out to be different from what he had imagined. Martha, his wife, no longer gave him the attention she once did. She was now busy caring for their granddaughter, pouring all her love into the little girl while forgetting about the man who had walked beside her through all the ups and downs of life. She slept with their grandchild, forgetting what it felt like to have a husband lying next to her. And Frank? He slowly became a shadow in his own home. Sometimes, loneliness doesn't come from having no one by your side, but from having someone there yet no longer being able to reach their heart. And so, Frank began to wonder, was there a place out there where he still mattered? Little did he know, this very question would lead him down a path he never expected. A lost spring, filled with challenges, temptations, and profound lessons about love, marriage, and forgiveness. Frank Thompson, 68 years old, was once a strong and passionate man, a skilled mechanic. He had spent his life working with complex machines, roaring engines, and the unmistakable scent of motor oil. His hands, once steady and powerful, could fix anything, from an old truck to intricate factory machinery. But now, in retirement, those hands had become idle. There were no more engines to repair, no more work to keep him busy, and he felt himself slowly becoming a forgotten piece of his own life. In the past, Frank believed that the happiness of old age meant leisurely mornings on the porch, sipping a hot cup of coffee, and enjoying the crisp air of their small town. He had thought that without work, he would have more time to cherish life with his wife Martha. But reality was far from what he had envisioned. Martha, 65, had been an elementary school teacher, a devoted woman who loved children and always put her family first. After retiring, she dedicated most of her time to taking care of their granddaughter, Emily, the daughter of their eldest son. Day by day, her life revolved around Emily. Driving her to school, cooking her favorite meals, playing with her, telling bedtime stories, and even sleeping beside her every night. Frank understood that Martha adored their granddaughter, but he never expected that the child's presence would make him feel so invisible in his wife's eyes. In the past, no matter how busy she was, she always made time for him. A morning coffee shared in quiet companionship, a bedtime story exchanged before sleep, a gentle hand to hold as they strolled through town. But now, all of that had faded away. During the day, she was busy with their granddaughter. At night, she slept with the child, leaving him alone in the large bedroom. At first, Frank tried to be patient, telling himself that things would eventually return to normal. But as time passed, he realized that the distance between them was only growing wider. Even their dinners had changed. In the past, he and Martha always ate together, chatting about the little things that happened during the day. Now, she ate with their granddaughter first, then cleaned up, while he often sat alone at the dinner table. One evening, Frank tried to do something to reconnect with his wife. He cooked dinner himself, choosing her old favorite, potato stew with tender beef. He set the table carefully and waited for her to join him. But when Martha walked into the kitchen, she simply said, "Go ahead and eat first. I need to put the little one to sleep." When had he become an afterthought in his own family? Frank was never good at expressing his feelings. His entire life, he had only known how to work hard and provide for his wife and children. But that didn't mean he didn't feel. He missed the evenings when they watched the news together, discussing the stories on TV. He missed the time she nagged him for leaving his things scattered around the house, only to quietly pick them up and put them back in place. All those small, ordinary moments had now become luxuries. Perhaps, long marriages were always like this. Love didn't disappear, but it also no longer burned as intensely as before. But Frank didn't want to believe that. He didn't want to accept that the remaining years of his life would be spent alone on the porch, silently watching life go by with no one to share it with. Spring was approaching. The air was warming, but Frank's heart remained cold. A thought suddenly flickered in his mind. Maybe somewhere out there was still a place for him, a place where he wasn't just a fading shadow in his own home. And that very thought would lead him down a path he never expected. A lost spring, filled with trials, temptations, and regrets. Frank had never imagined that marriage could become so quiet, so cold. He had always believed that retirement would bring him more time to enjoy life with Martha. Sipping morning coffee together, strolling through their small town, or simply sitting side by side, cherishing the peaceful moments after years of hard work. But nothing turned out the way he had hoped. Martha, his wife, now devoted all her attention to their 4-year-old granddaughter, Emily. The little girl was their eldest son's daughter, and after her parents' divorce, Martha had practically become a second mother to her. Her days were filled with picking Emily up from preschool, preparing meals, helping her with arts and crafts, and telling bedtime stories. And in her endless busyness, she had slowly pushed Frank out of her circle of care. At first, Frank didn't think much of it. He understood that Martha loved their granddaughter, and that was only natural. But over time, he began to realize just how much the distance between them had grown. They no longer spent time together as they once did. Their conversations became scarce. Their affectionate touches and warm smiles faded away. Every night, Martha slept beside Emily, leaving Frank alone in the spacious bedroom. He couldn't even remember the last time they had shared a bed. For the first time, Frank felt like an outsider in his own home. One evening, he decided to do something to rekindle their relationship. He cooked dinner himself, a simple meal but made with care. Beef stew and mashed potatoes, a dish Martha once loved. He set the table carefully, placing 2 plates side by side, just like the old days. When Martha walked into the kitchen, Frank smiled and said, "Martha, I made dinner for you. Let's eat together." But instead of sitting down, Martha glanced toward the living room, where Emily was sitting on the couch watching cartoons. She let out a quiet sigh. "Frank, I need to put the little one to bed first. He won't sleep without me." And with that, she turned away, leaving Frank sitting there, alone with a meal that was already growing cold. Frank watched his wife's retreating figure, a deep sense of disappointment settling over him. He picked up his fork but no longer felt like eating. The dinner he had looked forward to had become yet another lonely meal. For the first time he wondered, "Do I still matter to Martha?" Another time, as Frank sat in the living room reading the newspaper, Martha walked past. On instinct, he reached out and wrapped his arms around her. A reflexive gesture, a silent attempt to reconnect. But Martha, not realizing what it meant, unconsciously pulled away. "Frank, I'm busy. Let me check if the little one has fallen asleep." She left without even looking back. Frank stood there for a moment, the feeling of being shut out more palpable than ever. In the past, whenever he embraced Martha, she would smile and return his hug warmly. But now, even a simple embrace was no longer there. That night, Frank lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He thought about the past, about the mornings when Martha would make him coffee, about the evenings they spent side by side in their armchairs, watching the news together. He remembered how she used to nag him when he spilled water on the floor, only to quietly wipe it up later without a word. Those little things were now just memories. Frank was never good at expressing his emotions. His whole life, he had only known how to work hard and take care of his family. He believed that love didn't need to be spoken aloud, that it was shown through actions. Through waking up early to fix a leaky faucet, through driving out in the cold rain to pick Martha up. But now, he realized that if love wasn't spoken, if it wasn't expressed, it could fade away without either person even noticing. One evening, Frank decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. As Martha tucked Emily into bed, he sat beside her and spoke, his voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "Martha, I feel like we're drifting apart. Do you feel it too?" Martha looked at him, Her eyes filled with exhaustion. She let out a deep sigh. "Frank, I'm really tired. We're not young anymore. Please don't bother me." Her words cut through Frank like a knife. He didn't know what else to say. He stood up, stepped out onto the porch, and gazed up at the star-filled Texas sky. A cold wind blew past, carrying with it a loneliness he couldn't name. Frank had never felt so lost. In the days that followed, he tried to fill the growing emptiness inside him. He spent more time at the retirement club, where he could talk with men of his generation. He started frequenting a small cafe on Main Street, where the young barista always greeted him with a warm smile. At home, he felt like nothing more than a shadow, an unwelcome guest in his own house. He didn't want to leave, but every time he saw Martha doting on their grandson, his heart felt emptier. One evening, after having a few beers with friends, Frank came home and saw Martha sitting in the living room, cradling Emily as she slept. The dim light cast soft shadows on her face, making the lines of age more pronounced than ever. In that moment, Frank realized, maybe Martha was just as tired as he was. She hadn't meant to push him away. She hadn't meant to hurt him. She was simply a grandmother who loved her grandchild, and in the process, she had forgotten that Frank, too, needed to be loved. Frank had never imagined seeking comfort elsewhere. But as the days passed, with Martha growing more distant, he began to feel like he no longer belonged in his own home. He had no one to confide in, no one who truly listened. So, he started going out more often, searching for a place where he wouldn't feel so alone. One afternoon, while wandering through the quiet streets of town, Frank stopped in front of a cozy cafe called Linda's Place. It was a family-owned shop, not fancy, but warm and inviting, with old wooden tables and the soft glow of amber lights. He hesitated for a moment before pushing open the door, instantly greeted by the rich aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries. Linda, the owner, was a petite woman in her mid-50s, with a kind face that carried traces of a life well lived. She had been widowed years ago and ran the cafe on her own. When Frank stepped inside, she greeted him with a gentle smile. "Mr. Thompson, right? I've seen you walk by here before." Frank nodded and took a seat at the counter. Linda poured him a cup of steaming coffee. "You look tired. Everything okay?" Such a simple question, yet it made something inside Frank stir. For the first time in a long while, someone seemed to genuinely care about how he felt. At first, he made small talk about the town, about the auto repair shop he had worked at for years. But slowly, the words just started spilling out. He told her about Martha, about the growing distance between them, about the loneliness he felt in his own home. Linda listened attentively, without judgment, without rushing to offer advice. She simply sat there, occasionally nodding, sometimes offering a small smile. The way she listened made Frank feel more understood than he had in a long time. "I know that feeling," Linda said, gently turning her coffee cup in her hands. "After my husband passed, I felt like the loneliness would drive me insane. But then I realized, the only thing I could do was find a reason to keep going, no matter how small." Frank didn't know how to respond. He just sat in silence, staring into his coffee. Being in Linda's presence didn't make him feel guilty. He had no intention of betraying Martha. But here in this small cafe, he felt like a man who still had worth. Frank started visiting the cafe more often. At first, he justified it as a place to clear his mind. But he couldn't deny that his conversations with Linda felt more comforting than sitting in silence in his cold, distant home. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Linda looked at Frank and asked, "If you feel this lonely, why don't you talk to your wife about it?" Frank let out a dry chuckle. "I've tried. But it feels like she doesn't care anymore." Linda was quiet for a moment before saying gently, "Maybe she's feeling the same way." Her words lingered in Frank's mind. But before he could dwell on them, things became far more complicated. One evening, after the cafe had emptied, Linda was wiping down the tables while Frank remained at the counter. The room was quiet, except for the soft music playing from an old radio. "You seem sadder than usual today," Linda said, placing a gentle hand over Frank's. The touch was small, but it startled him. How long had it been since someone had shown him such tenderness? Frank looked up at Linda. Her eyes were warm, yet hesitant. His heartbeat quickened. For a fleeting moment, the space between them seemed to disappear. Linda leaned in slightly, and Frank, almost instinctively, moved closer too. But just before the distance between them vanished, reality struck him. Frank quickly pulled his hand away and cleared his throat. "I should go." Linda didn't argue. She simply nodded, slowly. As Frank stepped out of the cafe, he took a deep breath. He couldn't let himself go any further. But guilt had already started creeping into his heart. One morning, while shopping at the market, Martha ran into Mrs. Peterson, an old acquaintance from town. After exchanging a few pleasantries, Mrs. Peterson leaned in and whispered, "I saw your husband having quite the intimate conversation with that cafe owner, Linda." They looked close. Martha froze. Her heart pounded against her chest. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. That evening, when Frank walked through the door, Martha was already sitting in the living room, her face cold and unreadable. The tension in the air was undeniable. "Where have you been?" Martha asked, her voice steady but with a slight tremor. Frank set his hat down on the table and sighed. "I just went for a walk." Martha narrowed her eyes. "To Linda's cafe, right?" Frank froze. He hadn't expected her to know. "Did you forget that you have a family?" Martha's voice sharpened. "Do you think I don't know? I've heard people talk. They say you and that woman are very close. Do you still remember you're a married man?" Frank clenched his fists. "And what about you, Martha? You've forgotten about me a long time ago. You spend all day with Emily, and there's never any time left for me. I just wanted someone to talk to, someone who would listen." "Have you ever done that?" Martha stared at him, tears welling up in her eyes. "So, that's why you turned to another woman?" Frank had no answer. He felt as if he were teetering on the edge of an irreversible mistake. After their argument, Frank left the house. He had no destination in mind, just drove aimlessly through the familiar streets of town. His emotions were a tangled mess: anger, sadness, disappointment, and a deep, aching loneliness. Eventually, he found himself in front of a small building with a simple wooden sign, Maple Grove Retirement Club. This was where the older folks in town gathered, to talk, to pass the time, to find companionship. Frank stepped inside, not expecting much. But almost immediately, he realized he wasn't alone. In the cozy room filled with worn-out armchairs, a few men sat together, sipping coffee and chatting. Some women played cards by the window. No one seemed rushed. No one seemed forgotten. Here, time moved slower, gentler. "Frank? I never thought I'd see you here." A familiar voice called out. It was George, a man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes. He waved Frank over. Frank took a seat beside George, feeling a small sense of relief at being welcomed. "You doing all right?" George asked, his tone filled with genuine concern. Frank let out a long sigh. "I don't know, George. Lately, I feel like I don't matter anymore. Martha, she doesn't care about me the way she used to. And I don't know what to do." George nodded slowly. "I know that feeling. I've been there." Frank looked at him surprised. "Really?" George chuckled softly. "Yeah. After my wife passed, my kids gradually built their own lives. They love me, but they have their own families, jobs, responsibilities. I became more of a memory than a part of their daily lives. Eventually, I decided to move into a retirement home. At least there, I had people to talk to every day." Frank fell silent, absorbing those words. The thought of leaving home had never crossed his mind before. But now, it suddenly seemed like a possibility. A man sitting across from them spoke up. It was Tom, a former teacher with a silver beard and eyes full of contemplation. People think that as we grow old, we should just live quietly, waiting for our final days. But no one understands that we still need love, that we still need to feel cared for, Tom said, his voice thoughtful. I once had a close friend who passed away a few years ago. After his wife died, he withdrew from everyone, never reaching out. By the time he realized he needed someone to share his life with, it was too late. Tom's words left Frank deep in thought. He was right. Frank still needed love. He still needed to feel cared for. But more importantly, he needed to learn how to care for others in return. He had never truly put himself in Martha's shoes. Was she feeling the same loneliness but unable to express it? Frank stayed at the club until late in the afternoon. He listened to the stories of his fellow retirees and realized he was not alone in his sorrow. But at the same time, he came to an understanding. He couldn't keep running away. He had to face the truth, face his marriage, before it was too late. By the time Frank left the club, the sun was setting behind the rows of houses. A cool evening breeze drifted past, carrying the crisp air of the approaching night. He stood by his car, taking a deep breath. It was time to make a decision. Continue sinking into loneliness or try to repair what was broken in his marriage. That evening, Frank sat quietly in the worn-out armchair in his living room, his eyes resting on the family photo hanging on the wall. It was taken years ago, when he and Martha were young, when their children were small, when their home was filled with laughter. But now, this house no longer felt like a place he belonged to. The distance between him and Martha had grown too vast to mend. He felt like a ghost in his own home, and he couldn't bear it any longer. That night, as Martha finished putting their grandchild to sleep and walked into the kitchen to make tea, Frank finally spoke. Martha, I've been thinking a lot. Maybe I should find a place where I don't feel invisible. Martha paused for a moment, not looking up, simply continuing to pour tea into her cup. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Go wherever you want. Frank let out a dry chuckle. He wasn't sure what he had expected. A plea for him to stay? A sign that she still cared? A hint of reluctance? But Martha simply let go, as if his departure meant nothing. The next morning, Frank packed his belongings. There wasn't much to take. A few sets of clothes, some newspapers and books, an old family photo. As he wheeled his small suitcase to the door, Martha remained seated on the couch, staring at the television, though she didn't seem to be watching anything at all. I'm leaving now, Frank said. Martha gave a small nod, saying nothing more. Maplewood Retirement Home was not far from town. It was a peaceful place, with small gardens, long hallways, and simply furnished rooms. As Frank stepped inside, a young nurse greeted him with a polite but distant smile. Welcome, Mr. Thompson. You can go to your room now. We've prepared it for you. Frank's room was small but tidy. A single bed, a wooden desk, and a worn-out armchair. Nothing felt familiar. Nothing made him feel at home. But perhaps that was for the best. At least here, he wouldn't have to face Martha's indifferent gaze every day. The first few days passed in silence. Frank spent most of his time sitting by the window, gazing out at the garden. He met a few other residents, but no one made him feel comfortable. They all had their own stories, their own sorrows, and no one seemed to care enough to truly connect. One afternoon, while strolling through the garden, Frank ran into George, the man he had met at the retirement club. You ended up here too? George said with a faint smile. Frank sighed. I thought this place might be better. But honestly, nothing has really changed. George nodded. I used to think the same. But the truth is, no matter where we go, we can't escape loneliness. That thought haunted Frank for the rest of the evening. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had made the right decision. He had left home, left Martha, yet the emptiness still clung to him. Here, no one truly cared about him. He was just one of dozens of old men, waiting for the days to pass in quiet solitude. Then one night, Frank had a dream. He dreamt of his old house, of Martha sitting by the window, her back turned to him. He called her name, but she didn't respond. He stepped closer, reached out to touch her shoulder, only for her to vanish into thin air, like a wisp of smoke. Frank woke up with a start, his heart pounding. He had never felt loss so vividly before. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe instead of running away, he needed to face the real problem. The next morning, Frank walked into the administrator's office. "I want to leave," he said. The administrator looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Thompson, you've only been here for less than a month. Are you sure?" Frank nodded. "I need to go home." At first, Frank had felt relieved in the nursing home. He no longer had to endure Martha's coldness or the feeling of being invisible in his own house. He could wake up whenever he wanted, without the sound of his grandchild crying or conversations he felt excluded from. Here, he had new friends, scheduled meals, and activities to pass the time. Frank quickly befriended some of the other residents. He played chess with George, chatted with Helen, a cheerful widow, and joined the morning exercise sessions. Everything seemed fine. For a while. But gradually, Frank realized the nursing home wasn't what he had imagined. Many of the residents here were far lonelier than he was. They sat for hours by the window, waiting for family to visit, but most of the time, no one came. Some had been here for years, their visits growing fewer and fewer until they stopped entirely. Frank began to feel afraid. He didn't want to become one of them. The recreational activities that once seemed enjoyable now felt meaningless. The movie nights no longer excited him, and the evening dances were just elderly people trying to find a fleeting moment of joy in their emptiness. Frank realized that despite being surrounded by others, there was no real love here. Everyone carried their own sorrows, but no one could truly fill the void in each other's hearts. One morning, as he woke up, Frank suddenly realized that he missed home. He missed the aroma of Martha's morning coffee, the way she always made it a little stronger because she knew he liked it that way. He missed the sound of her murmuring while watching TV, the quiet evenings they spent together, even if they didn't talk much. At home, despite the distance between them, he still felt Martha's presence. But here, he was just another old man among dozens of others, with no one who truly cared for him the way a family does. One day, while walking down the hallway, Frank heard quiet sobbing. He stopped, glanced through a slightly open door, and saw an elderly man sitting on his bed, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. In his hands was an old photograph. Frank hesitated for a moment, then gently knocked. "Are you okay?" Frank asked softly. The old man looked up, his eyes red. "Today is my birthday," he said between sobs. "But no one came. I thought my son would visit. But he's busy." "He's always busy." Frank stood there, speechless. He looked at the man before him, a father, someone who once had a family, now left with nothing but memories and fading hope. The sight made Frank shudder. In that moment, he understood something. If he didn't go back one day, he too would sit here, clutching an old photograph, waiting for people who would never come. Frank left the room with a heavy heart. He knew he had been wrong. Not for wanting love and attention, but for giving up on his family too easily. Martha might have grown distant, but she was still his wife. They had spent a lifetime together, building a family. And family, no matter how strained, was still where he belonged. The next morning, Frank walked into the administrator's office. "I want to leave," he said. The administrator looked at him in surprise. "Mr. Thompson, you've only been here for less than a month. Are you sure?" Frank nodded. "I need to go home." He packed up his few belongings. As he held his small suitcase in his hands, he took one last look at the room he had thought would bring him freedom and peace. But now, all he saw was emptiness and coldness. On the ride home, Frank sat in silence. His heart was heavy with mixed emotions. Would Martha welcome him back? Had she already grown used to life without him? But no matter the outcome, he knew this was the right decision. As he stepped through the door, he saw Martha sitting quietly in the kitchen. The familiar scent of coffee lingered in the air, reminding him of all their mornings together. Martha looked up, her eyes flashing with surprise, but her expression quickly turned unreadable. "Tired of your new life already?" she asked, her voice still tinged with distance. Frank set down his suitcase and slowly walked over to her. "I was wrong, Martha. I thought leaving would be better, but I was mistaken. I don't want to live without you." Martha looked at him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Finally, she let out a soft sigh. "Neither do I." They had been apart for too long. That night, they sat together, reflecting on the years that had passed. Frank didn't expect Martha to change completely, and she didn't expect him to become someone new. They both understood now that marriage wasn't just about love, it was about understanding and sharing, even when things weren't perfect. Their relationship didn't return to what it once was overnight, but there was a renewed connection between them. From that day on, they learned to be patient with each other, to be kind, and most importantly, to move forward together. One morning, as Frank sat in the kitchen, Martha placed a cup of coffee in front of him. "It's a bit stronger today. That's how you like it, isn't it?" Frank gently picked up the cup, memories flooding back. "Yes, it is. I love it." Outside the window, the sun was rising, warm and golden. A new beginning for them both. After his return, Frank and Martha started spending more time together. They didn't dwell too much on the past, but in their own way, they both understood that changes were needed to hold on to what remained. Frank began helping Martha take care of their grandchild, something he had never done before. Watching the little one run around the yard, he realized that family wasn't just an obligation, it was also a joy. Martha changed too. She started listening to Frank more, no longer interrupting when he shared the small, mundane details of his day. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old cabinet, Frank stumbled upon a yellowed letter. It was a letter Martha had written to him during the war, when he had been away on military duty. The handwriting was shaky, but filled with love. "My dearest Frank, I miss you so much. Every day, I wait for your letters. As long as I know you're safe, I can find peace. One day, we will grow old together, sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. Please come back to me." Frank held the letter, his throat tightening. How long had it been since he had forgotten how deeply Martha had once loved him? He had resented her coldness, but perhaps, over the years, he had also allowed the distance between them to grow. That evening, as Martha sat in the kitchen, Frank quietly placed the letter in front of her. She looked down, her expression softening. She picked it up, rereading the words she had written so long ago, then silently folded it back. "Do you remember?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I once wrote that we would grow old together." Frank smiled, gently taking her hand. "And now we still have time to do just that." The next day, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. No more resentment, no more distance. Just two elderly souls holding hands, cherishing the peace they had almost lost. A new beginning, late but deeply meaningful. The story of Frank and Martha conveys a profound message about love, understanding, and communication in marriage, especially in later years. Marriage isn't just about sharing responsibilities. It's about nurturing emotions every day. When understanding and communication are neglected, distance begins to grow, making both partners feel lonely and disconnected, even within their own home. This story also emphasizes that the elderly still have emotional needs. They need care, companionship, and affection from their spouse. Neglecting a partner, whether intentionally or unintentionally, only deepens feelings of loneliness and abandonment. Sometimes, loneliness leads to misguided decisions, like leaving home in search of emotional fulfillment elsewhere, only to realize that family is the only place that offers true warmth and comfort. Ultimately, the greatest takeaway from this story is that family is the most precious thing. Unfortunately, We often realize this only when we're on the verge of losing it. Let's cherish what we have and not let misunderstandings, distance, or daily routines push us apart. Both marriage and family require love, understanding, and effort from both sides to truly thrive. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Frank and Martha's story. I hope it has given you valuable reflections on love, family, and the importance of understanding in life. Every story carries a meaningful lesson, and I am grateful to have you with me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to your loved ones. Once again, thank you for supporting this channel. I hope you continue to cherish every moment with your family and loved ones. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss future stories. Thank you, and see you in the next one.